A week ago this evening, I returned from 5 days and nights in Cuba with the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Our journey began in Santa Clara, where we visited Congregation Am Shalom. The community is tiny, and the handful of members were there to greet us. The modest sanctuary features a holy ark, so we asked if there's a Torah there and if it's regularly read. Yes, there's a Torah, but no, it had not been read in many years, since nobody there knows how. That congregation does not usually have a rabbi, but that day there were 20 or so. We quickly ended their Torah drought. We sang joyously, took the Torah from the ark, chanted the opening verses of Genesis in unison. The president of the congregation, a tall, burly man of about 70, began to cry. Soon, there was not a dry eye in the room. Like the group in Santa Clara, the entire Jewish community of Cuba is minuscule. After reaching a high of some 25,000 at the end of World War II, fewer than 1,000 Jews remain in Cuba today. They did not leave because of anti-Semitism, however. Most of us know an infamous story about Cuba from the Nazi era. A steamship full of Jews, German Jews, the St. Louis, sailed from Hamburg to Havana, where the passengers had entry visas. By the time they arrived, those visas had been revoked. On the whole, though, Cuba saved some 12,000 Jews from the hands of the Nazis, more in raw numbers than Canada and most other Latin American countries, and more per capita than the United States. By 1959, on the eve of the revolution, over a third of Cuba's post-war Jewish population had already left. Most saw Cuba as only a temporary refuge, and they made aliyah to Israel, went to the United States, and found greater opportunity in other lands. Other Cuban Jews left the country in the wake of the revolution, most of them heading to the United States or Israel. Though few Cuban Jews who immigrated to Israel stayed in the Jewish state, Israel is key to the story. Thanks to Israel's law of return, opening that country to all Jewish immigrants, Jewish Cubans had an easier entry to the free world than non-Jewish Cubans, even if they merely passed through Israel on their way to elsewhere. Still more Jews have left Cuba in the last 30 years, a time of greater religious freedom for everyone in Cuba, including Jews, but also a time of economic deprivation as Cuba's economy tanked after the fall of the Soviet Union. In Havana, the communities are a bit larger than the one we visited in Santa Clara. Though Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews in Cuba, that is, Jews who trace their ancestry from Spain or Portugal on the one hand, and Jews with roots in Central and Eastern Europe on the other, have historically maintained separate congregations, and there is still one of each. The two congregations now worship together at the Ashkenazic synagogue, where the religious school of 80 students also meets. The Sephardic synagogue houses an active program for Jewish seniors. At the Patronato, the main synagogue, the Torah is read regularly. Thanks to the Joint Distribution Committee, or JDC, the community's basic needs are met. With donations from Jewish groups from abroad, groups like ours, for example, which come regularly, the synagogue operates a pharmacy administered by physicians to provide sorely needed over-the-counter medications and other medical provisions to Cubans in need, Jewish or otherwise. The Cuban healthcare system provides prescription medicine, but other medical necessities are in short supply. Most notable about our visit to the Patronato was that we could just walk in. The gates were open, the doors were open, there was no security guard present. None was needed. Anti-Semitism is a non-factor in the lives of Cuban Jews today and has not significantly impacted the community throughout its history. Less comforting were the nearly ubiquitous signs of opposition to Israel. That's not surprising for a poor country not aligned with the United States, but Cuba has a special reason for its antipathy toward Israel. Once a year, every year, the United Nations General Assembly takes up a resolution to condemn the United States for its disastrous and ineffective economic boycott of Cuba. Only 2 countries vote against that resolution in the UN each year, the US and Israel. Cuban Jews are Zionists, and they lament their nation's anti-Israel posture, but they do not suffer anti-Semitism because of it. Here's what I learned from the Jewish community of Cuba, underlining lessons I already knew. Israel is key to the Jewish people's well-being. Even if most Jews who immigrated to Israel did not stay, their freedom to move to Israel under the law of return offered them opportunities that non-Jewish Cubans lacked. 2. The Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, also known as the Joint, is a gem of the Jewish world, and too few American Jews know about it. We may donate it to it directly, and many Jewish federations make an allocation to it. The Joint takes care of needy Jewish individuals and communities throughout the world. Wherever Jews live, Jews need, from time to time, to get up and go to find a new place to live freely and prosperously as Jews. This week, we read from the Torah about Abraham and Sarah, called by God, Lech-L'cha, Lech-L'cha, get up and go to the land of God's promise. That story is told in 9 brief verses. In verse 10, a famine hits the land, so Abraham and Sarah leave for Egypt. Now that sounds like a shocking repudiation of God's blessing. How can they leave the place which God has called them? Rashi, though, understands it as a test. Would Abraham and Sarah accept a command to leave the promised land as readily as the invitation to go there for blessing? In the commentator's mind, our matriarch and patriarch passed the test. We often think of the Jewish history of immigration as largely having been motivated by persecution. That was certainly true at the time of the Holocaust and at other terrible times in our history. More commonly, though, Jewish people have immigrated for the same reason that others do. Beginning with Abraham and Sarah's descent into Egypt, we have migrated primarily to find economic opportunity, sometimes to avoid starvation. That is the story of Jewish immigration from Cuba. Our people left not to flee anti-Semitism, but to escape poverty. Thank God, America has been a land of freedom and opportunity for the Jewish people, with historically unprecedented consistency, however imperfect, from before this nation was founded to this very day. Still, Rabbi Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, the late great dean of American Jewish history, remarked, "Every Jew should have a packed suitcase and a valid passport. As for me, my passport is valid, my suitcase empty." My entire my family has been in this country since 3 generations before my Jewish ancestors served in the New York militia during the American Revolution. America is my home, and still I know, and I have always taught my sons, we are Jews, just like the Jews of Cuba and the many thousands more who left that island nation. When we hear God's call, Lech-L'cha, like Sarah and Abraham before us, we too must be ready to heed the call to the land of God's blessing for the people of Israel. Amen.